Okay. Well, today's lecture is called Death from the Stars, Alien Viruses. And I guess the whole issue of viruses, when we think of viruses, you know, we think of things that affect us from the Earth and on the Earth. We don't really give much consideration to the idea that there could be viruses out there in outer space. And of course, the big question is, have they ever come to Earth? Has an alien virus ever reached the Earth? And if so, how would we combat it, or could we even combat it? These are the big questions that would face us, and do face us, you know, if we do decide to go into outer space one day, in terms of actually sending people to another planet, I mean. If you look at the moon, for example, with a vacuum, chiefly speaking, a virus can't exist in a vacuum. But on a planet with an atmosphere, then potentially you're in a very different environment to where possibly astronauts went to Mars, somewhere like that, and came back and they were contaminated with, you know, a really invisible to the naked eye virus, and it was released on our planet. Then the big question is, could we survive it? Could we find an antidote for it? And these are important questions that they're not really theoretical, because NASA and many space agencies around the world have addressed this issue very, very deeply. And about 7 or 8 years ago, a friend of mine, Dr. Bob Wood, he has researched this area very, very deeply, and he asked me if I wanted to ghostwrite his book, which is called Alien Viruses. That's Bob's book that's just come out, and it's got my name on it, but it's a bit of a departure for me, really, because most of the time I write my own books on this subject or that subject, you know, whether UFOs or Bigfoot. But I also do a lot of ghostwriting for authors, and when you co-write a book with somebody else, you know, you're sort of doing the research and the work together and coming to the conclusions. But when you ghostwrite a book, it's basically where somebody has all the information and maybe they don't have the time to write the book themselves, or perhaps they've never written a book before, they're not sure how to go about it, and so they hire someone who, you know, they basically hand over all the material, and then it's up to like the ghostwriter to make some sense out of it and write it in the, hopefully, a credible, readable fashion. And so that's what I did with this book. Bob hired me to write the book based on his research and investigations. And the reason why I decided to take the project on is because he's actually uncovered a really intriguing story, an entire aspect of the UFO phenomenon that largely most people don't know about, and has been sort of very much underappreciated in terms of its importance and significance. And this is the book, which unfortunately the copies out over there were already sold out, but you can get it through Amazon, Barnes & Noble and places like that, and sort of any good online book selling services. And as you can see, that's the front cover of the book. And I'll just give you some background on Bob so you'll know who he is and where he's coming from. He's sort of a very credible guy with a deep military and government background. Bob Wood received a BS in Aeronautical Engineering from the University of Colorado in 1949, a PhD in Physics from Cornell in 1953, worked for General Electric Aeronautics and Ordnance, and served in the US Army at the Aberdeen Proving Ground for 2 years, and then completed 43 years with Douglas Aircraft. And so in other words, he's a very scientific guy, level-headed, you know, looks at facts and figures and so on, and looks for evidence. And so this was the main reason why I decided, as I said, to go with the project, and because nobody really tackled it before and wasn't really aware of it. Well, when it comes to things like alien viruses, this has certainly been covered in fiction for many, many years. For example, H.G. Wells's novel, The War of the Worlds, you know, you imagine kind of some Independence Day style invasion of the planet. And in the novel, we actually win the war against the aliens, despite the fact that it's set in the 19th century and we have no advanced technology. And the reason the aliens are beaten is because they fall victim to the flu virus, which, you know, we can fight off. Whether antibiotics or you just sort of sweat it through, you know, but it goes away. But the aliens, the Martians in War of the Worlds, had no way to combat the flu virus, and so it wiped them all out. And more recently, late 60s I should say, Michael Crichton, who wrote Jurassic Park, had a novel published called The Andromeda Strain, which was later made into a movie. And that deals with the same kind of thing, where a NASA spacecraft goes out into space, and when it comes back to the Earth, it crash lands near a little isolated town in the deserts of Arizona. And unbeknownst to NASA, there are these small microbes that attach themselves to the craft. And they then are exposed to the Earth's atmosphere, and they start spreading, and people begin dropping like flies, and the race is on to try and find an antidote, a cure for this extraterrestrial virus. So, in other words, in the world of fiction, there's a lot of sort of entertaining, intriguing and thought-provoking stories about what would happen if an alien virus did reach the Earth. But the big question, of course, is, has it happened in reality? And Bob's research suggests it has on many, many occasions. Now, fortunately, we're not talking like a virus, like the zombie virus that's going to turn us all into flesh-eating maniacs or whatever. It's nothing like that. But all the evidence kind of suggests that we are talking about something that could be lethal to the human race in terms of us not having an antidote for it and not really understanding it even. And so that is sort of the paramount angle that Bob's followed from the issue of government secrecy as it relates to this subject. Namely, is it all being kept under wraps because there's a fear that one day there could be an outbreak? And if there has been in the past, has it been contained but we don't know what to do with it? So, you know, possibly the people who were infected and the virus itself, you know, may remain in like a sterile environment where everybody's frightened to go, who can even have access to it. They just leave it well alone because they don't want to sort of let the genie out the bottle, so to speak, and having no way to put it back in. So these are all sort of the complex areas that this particular story covers. Oh, excuse me. Now, I mentioned sort of in the world of fiction. In the world of reality, when the Apollo astronauts first went to the moon in 1969, when they came back, they all had to go through like a decontamination program, as all the NASA astronauts who went to the moon did as well. And again, this is primarily to try and wipe out any potentially deadly or hostile, if you like, bacteria, viruses that could have come back. Now, we saw no evidence, certainly, that, you know, anybody who went to the moon did come back with anything like that. You know, there was no sudden outbreak of weird diseases suggesting that that was the case. So chances are they probably didn't bring anything back at all. But if they did, then the decontamination process worked. But as we'll see later, that may not have been the case all the time. Now, since then, numerous nations beyond NASA have put legislation together for maybe on the day when we go to Mars. And because Mars, you know, has an atmosphere, and there are certain indications that there's water on Mars, possibly even vegetation from some of the weirder pictures that have come back from NASA. So if that is the case and there's life there, you know, that potentially offers a possibility of bacteria, viruses, so forth. And people agencies have actually prepared for the idea of, you know, sort of the outbreak of a very violent and virulent disease that would potentially be unstoppable. You know, it's very often the case that agencies prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But there are contingency plans in Russia, in the UK, in the European Space Agency to deal with and try and combat things along these lines. Now that's Bob on the left, and that's his son Ryan. And both Bob and Ryan have been interested and involved in the UFO subject for many years. Bob's interest goes back to the 1960s when he was with McDonnell Douglas, and Ryan, obviously growing up with his dad, developed an interest from there. And Ryan runs a website called majesticdocuments.com. And if any of you have heard of Majestic 12 or MJ12, it's supposedly a ultra classified group within the government that investigates UFOs and keeps the lid on Roswell, and the stories about alien bodies and alien autopsies, all that kind of thing, supposedly comes under the umbrella, if you like, of this group called MJ12. Now, officially, MJ12 doesn't exist. The government doesn't deny talking about it or avoid talking about it. They say, no, there is no such group and there are no official documents. The story itself actually goes back to 1984, when a researcher named Bill Moore, who lives out in California, received in the mail what was essentially like a camera film of documents that basically went back to 1947 and told this story of how reportedly a UFO crashed at Roswell and President Truman set up this secret committee, MJ12, to investigate it, to try and figure out where the craft came from, to autopsy the bodies, and reportedly they brought in all these top scientists, people in biology, physics, chemistry, etc., who would all sort of have a role to play in the project itself. And a lot of questions have been asked about the documents. That's one of them. As you can see, there's top secret, eyes only, the White House, Washington, and Harry Truman's signature at the bottom. And that's supposedly that document, September 24, 1947, is supposedly the official document where Truman set up Operation Majestic 12. Now, of course, the important thing to note is that there are just as many people within the UFO field who feel the document is genuine versus who feel it's like some sort of ingenious hoax or disinformation or something like that to confuse the issue even more. And, you know, we just don't know. The problem is we don't have original documents to review, we just have photocopies. So, you know, it's not like we can analyse the paper as, you know, did it date from 1947, that kind of thing. So, you know, it's very much a controversial area, but Bob and Ryan went out on a limb and started investigating these documents because although the initial files, as I said, surfaced in 1984 to a researcher named Bill Moore who co-wrote the first book on Roswell called The Roswell Incident. But in the mid-1990s, literally thousands of pages of more documents on MJ12 surfaced from a California researcher named Timothy Cooper. Now, these files created as much controversy as this one did. But what was really interesting about Cooper's material, as I said, it ran to thousands of pages, and all of the, regardless of the content of the documents, all of the documents themselves were clearly written with 1940s and 1950s style typewriters. And there was somewhere in the region of like 14 or 15 different types of typeface. So even if this was a hoax or, you know, fakery, somebody had gone to extraordinary lengths because, you know, it's not that easy to find 14 or 15 relatively different 1940s and 50s typewriters. And checks were done to see if anybody in the area had bought up, you know, from an old typewriter store, a bunch of typewriters. Nothing like that was ever uncovered. So if the documents are faked, then a lot of work's gone into them, which has given rise to the suggestion that they're not just hoaxes, that there's some kind of disinformation, or they're the real thing, or there's some kind of grey area between the two. And so Ryan and Bob befriended Tim Cooper, began talking to him, and Cooper revealed how he got 5 or 6 insider sources, sort of whistleblower types, who he claimed had given all this material to him. And again, if it was just a hoax by Cooper, as some people do think, you know, it was, as I said, it runs to thousands of pages. It's not like the original ones, which were just 7 or 8. And so that really kind of, for me at least, rules out the idea that it was just Cooper, you know, just trying to pull the wool over people's eyes or whatever. And so Bob and Ryan started digging into this further and further, and essentially came to the conclusion that the documents told what was a true story. But what was interesting is that one of Cooper's sources, Thomas Cantwell, told Cooper that the documents were what he called constructs, and that's to say they contained real information, but Cantwell claimed that he wrote them in a fashion, or he reproduced them based on original existing documents, but rewrote them in a fashion which wouldn't allow Cooper to be prosecuted for being in possession of classified materials, because technically they weren't classified because they were rewritten. I guess from a legal perspective, you know, that still leaves the door open. But on the other hand, the official word from the government is that MJ12, Majestic 12, doesn't exist. So, in other words, it would be hard for Cooper to have action taken against him when the government has already said the documents are bogus, which it does say. So, you know, it's a bit of a catch-22 for everybody, really. But Bob and Ryan began digging more into it, started going to the National Archives, tracking down official files on the people who were supposedly in Majestic 12. And as they were doing this, they began to get more and more documents from Cooper, many of which started talking about this whole issue of strange deaths and weird viruses related to people who were involved in a number of the crashed UFO events that supposedly MJ12 were overseeing. Now, one of them, of course, sort of inevitably revolves around the Roswell incident.